Deep in the heart of the ancient village of Eldermist, where mist clung to the trees like a shroud, a young dreamer named Kale stumbled upon something that would change their world forever. Hidden within the crumbling ruins of a forgotten temple, a scroll lay waiting its surface, etched with symbols that glowed faintly, as if alive. The moment Kale touched it, a whisper seemed to rise from the parchment, speaking of a legend lost to time, a tale so powerful it could save their dying world. But this was no ordinary story. It was a call to action, a challenge that would force Kale to choose between the safety of their village and the unknown dangers that lay beyond. This wasn't just about curiosity, it was about survival. The scroll hinted at a power long thought extinct, a force that could either restore balance or unleash chaos. As Kale made the fateful decision to follow its whispers, they unknowingly set into motion a chain of events that would ripple across their world. But they weren't the only ones listening. Somewhere in the shadows, something stirred a presence ancient and malevolent, watching, waiting. What would you do if you held the key to saving your world, but the cost was everything you've ever known? Kale's journey is about to begin, and it's a tale of courage, mystery, and the kind of choices that define not just a life, but an entire world. Let's step into the story and uncover the secrets of the forgotten scroll. Kale's fingers trace the first symbol on the ancient scroll, its lines glowing faintly under the flicker of torchlight. With a surge of excitement and dread, the symbol unraveled into a map to the Shimmering Caverns, a place whispered about in legends but never found. Stories of its beauty were overshadowed by tales of peril, of adventurers who vanished within its depths, never to return. Kale's heart raced. This was the first step toward uncovering the scroll's secrets, but it came with a heavy choice. Lyra, Kale's childhood friend, stood nearby, her eyes wide with curiosity and determination. She offered to join, her voice steady despite the danger ahead. Kale hesitated. The risks were immense, and the thought of losing Lyra to the unknown was unbearable. But her presence had always been a source of strength, a reminder of the bond they'd forged over years of shared dreams and hardships. After a moment of quiet deliberation, Kale nodded. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead. The journey to the caverns was treacherous, the path winding through dense forests and jagged cliffs. When they finally reached the entrance, a towering arch of shimmering crystal greeted them, its surface catching the light like 1,000 stars. But as they stepped inside, the air grew heavy and a figure materialized before them, a guardian spirit, ethereal and imposing. Its voice echoed through the cavern, demanding a sacrifice to pass. Kale's unease deepened as the spirit spoke of the scroll's true purpose, its words cryptic and ominous. The path you tread will awaken what should remain buried, it warned. Lyra's hand tightened around Kale's, her resolve unwavering. They pressed on, leaving the spirit's warning echoing in their minds. As they emerged from the caverns, the ground beneath their feet trembled faintly, a subtle but unmistakable tremor. It was a reminder that their journey had stirred something far greater than they'd imagined. The scroll's mystery was no longer just a puzzle to solve. It was a force to reckon with, and the stakes were higher than ever. The air in the whispering forest was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the soft, almost imperceptible murmurs of the trees. Kale and Lyra stepped beneath the canopy, their boots crunching on the forest floor as the towering trunks seemed to close in around them. Each step deeper into the woods felt like entering a realm where time itself had slowed, where the past and present blurred into one. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to lean closer, their whispers carrying fragments of stories long forgotten. Lyra paused, her hand brushing against the bark of an oak, as if trying to decipher its secrets. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's like the forest is trying to tell us something." Their journey through the forest led them to a small clearing where a figure stood waiting. Auron, the hermit, was a man whose presence felt as old as the trees themselves. His weathered face and tattered cloak gave him an air of timeless wisdom, yet his eyes glimmered with a sharp, unsettling intensity. He introduced himself with a cryptic smile, his voice low and deliberate. "You've come seeking the forgotten scroll," he said, as though the words themselves carried weight. Kale's eyes lit up, his curiosity piqued, while Lyra's expression grew wary. Auron's gaze shifted between them, his tone growing somber. "The scroll is no mere relic. It is bound to an ancient curse, one that has claimed many who sought its power." Kale leaned forward, undeterred by the warning. "We need to find it," he insisted, his voice brimming with determination. Lyra, however, hesitated. "If it's cursed, maybe we should reconsider," she said, her concern evident. But Kale's resolve was unshakable. He turned to Auron, pleading for guidance. After a long moment, the hermit relented, agreeing to lead them to the next clue, a hidden shrine concealed deep within the forest. As they ventured further, the tension between Kale and Lyra began to simmer. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that Kale's obsession with the scroll was clouding his judgment, while Kale dismissed her fears as hesitation. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to resist them. The whispers grew louder, shifting from faint murmurs to urgent warnings. The once dappled sunlight faded, replaced by a heavy gloom that clung to the air like a shroud. Lyra's unease deepened with every step, her gaze darting to the shadows that seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of her vision. "This place doesn't want us here," she murmured, her voice tinged with dread. Kale, however, pressed on, driven by an unrelenting need to uncover the truth. The shrine loomed ahead, its presence both ominous and alluring, as if daring them to step closer. The forest's whispers now felt like a chorus of voices, each one pleading for them to turn back. But Kale, undeterred, stepped forward, and Lyra had no choice but to follow. The air inside the shrine felt heavy, almost alive, as Kale's hand brushed against the ancient mechanism. A faint hum resonated through the chamber, and suddenly, the walls shimmered with light, revealing a vision that seemed to pull them into another time. Before their eyes unfolded a chaotic scene. Dreamers, their faces etched with determination and fear, clashed against a shadowy force. The veil. Its form was a swirling mass of darkness, consuming everything in its path. The dreamers fought valiantly, but the cost was staggering. In the midst of the chaos, the forgotten scroll glowed with an otherworldly light, and with it, the veil was sealed away. But the victory came at a price: lives lost, realms fractured, and a lingering sense of sorrow that lingered in the air like a ghost. Kale staggered back, their breath uneven as the vision faded. The weight of what they just witnessed pressed down on them, a mix of awe and unease settling in their chest. The scroll wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon, a force capable of great destruction. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of their mind, Kale couldn't shake the belief that its power could still be used for good. They clenched their fists, resolve hardening. "We can't turn back now," they murmured, more to themselves than anyone else. But Lyra stood frozen, her eyes wide with dread. "Didn't you see what that thing did?" She snapped, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous, Kale. This isn't just some artifact, it's a curse. People died because of it. Realms were torn apart. Are you really willing to risk that again?" Her words were sharp, but beneath them was a plea, a desperate hope that Kale would listen. Kale turned to her, their expression conflicted. "I know what I saw, Lyra, but I also know what's at stake if we don't act. The veil isn't gone. Not completely. If it returns, we'll need the scroll to stop it. We can't just walk away." Lyra shook her head, her voice rising. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't just about saving the world. It's about what it's doing to you. You're so focused on this quest that you're not seeing the danger right in front of you. I can't be a part of this anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Without waiting for a response, she turned and strode out of the shrine, her footsteps echoing until they faded into silence. Alone, Kale stood in the dim light, the weight of their choices pressing down harder than ever. The shrine felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. They took a deep breath, trying to steady themselves, but the sense of isolation was unmistakable. Lyra had been their anchor, their voice of reason, and now she was gone. As they stepped forward, the path ahead seemed darker, the challenges more daunting. Yet Kale pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and the quiet, gnawing fear that maybe Lyra had been right all along. The sunken citadel loomed ahead, its jagged spires piercing the surface of the cursed lake like broken bones. Kale stood at the water's edge, the air thick with the scent of decay and the faint hum of ancient magic. The fortress was a relic of a forgotten age, swallowed by the lake centuries ago, and now it served as a tomb for secrets and horrors alike. The waters were unnaturally still, reflecting the pale moonlight in ripples that seemed to whisper warnings. But Kale had no choice. This was where the next fragment of the key lay hidden, and time was running out. Wading into the lake, the cold water bit at Kale's skin, sending shivers down their spine. The surface barely rippled as they moved, as though the lake itself resisted their presence. Beneath the water, the ruins of the Citadel stretched downward, its walls covered in moss and strange, glowing runes. Every step forward felt heavier, as if the cursed waters were trying to drag them under. But Kale pressed on, their focus sharp, knowing that hesitation could mean death. As they descended deeper, spectral guardians began to materialize from the shadows, ghostly figures clad in ancient armor, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruder. These were no ordinary spirits. They were bound to the Citadel, tasked with protecting its secrets at all costs. Kale's heart raced as the first guardian lunged, its translucent blade slicing through the water with terrifying speed. Dodging just in time, Kale drew their own weapon, a blade forged with enchanted steel, and countered with a strike that sent the guardian dissipating into mist. But more were coming, their eerie whispers echoing through the water. The battle was a blur of movement and desperation. Kale's lungs burned from holding their breath, their movements slowed by the weight of the water. Yet they fought with a determination born of necessity, using every trick and spell at their disposal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last guardian faded into nothingness. Kale swam toward the heart of the Citadel, where a faint golden light pulsed from within a crumbling altar. The Fragment. As Kale grasped the Fragment, a sudden surge of energy ripped through the water, nearly knocking them off their feet. From the depths, a voice called out soft, pleading, and achingly familiar. "Kale, help me." It was Lyra. For a moment, hope surged in Kale's chest, but then realization struck like a hammer. Lyra couldn't be here. This was a trap. Before they could react, tendrils of darkness erupted from the shadows, wrapping around their limbs and pulling them deeper into the abyss. Panic set in as Kale struggled against the Veil's minions, their strength waning with every second. But just as the darkness threatened to consume them, Kale remembered the Fragment in their hand. Channeling its power, they unleashed a burst of radiant energy, shattering the tendrils and sending the minions retreating into the shadows. Gasping for air, Kale swam toward the surface, their mind racing. The Veil knew about their quest. It was watching, waiting, and now it was actively working against them. Breaking the surface, Kale dragged themselves onto the shore, clutching the Fragment tightly. The weight of what they had just experienced settled heavily on their shoulders. This was no longer just a race against time. It was a fight for survival. The Veil's power was growing, and every step forward brought them closer to a confrontation they might not survive. But Kale knew one thing for certain: failure wasn't an option. The world depended on them, and they couldn't afford to falter now. Kale's heart pounded as he finally caught sight of Lyra, her figure emerging from the mist like a fleeting dream. Her eyes, once bright with determination, now carried a shadow of regret. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to leave you." "Something attacked me, shadowy creatures, unlike anything I've ever seen." Kale listened, his relief mingling with unease. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than he'd imagined. Together, they turned their attention to the next clue, a cryptic inscription etched into the ancient parchment. Lyra's sharp mind and Kale's intuition worked in tandem, unraveling the riddles that pointed them toward the skybound peaks. Legend spoke of these mountains as a place where the earth kissed the heavens, a realm of both beauty and peril. But as they began their ascent, the physical toll of the journey paled in comparison to the strain it placed on their bond. "Why do you care so much about this scroll?" Lyra asked one night, her voice tinged with frustration. "It feels like it's all that matters to you now." Kale hesitated, his guilt gnawing at him. He knew he'd been consumed by the mission, but in his heart, he believed the scroll held the key to saving not just their world, but their future together. "It's not just about the scroll," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's about us, about making sure we have a chance to live without fear." The tension between them lingered as they pressed on, the air growing thinner and the path steeper with each step. The skybound peaks loomed above, their jagged summits piercing the clouds. But as they neared the top, the weather shifted abruptly. A storm rolled in, dark and unnatural, the kind that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the wind howled with a voice that felt almost alive. The energy around them was oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were resisting their presence. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their earlier conflict momentarily forgotten. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The storm wasn't just a test of their endurance. It was a warning. The scroll had brought them this far, but the real challenge was only beginning. As the first drops of icy rain struck their faces, they braced themselves, knowing that whatever lay ahead would demand not just their strength, but their unity. At the summit, the air grew thin, and the winds howled like ancient voices, warning of what lay ahead. Before Kael and Lyra stood a temple of shimmering stone, its entrance guarded by a celestial being, cloaked in radiant light. Its voice echoed with the weight of ages, demanding they prove their worth before stepping inside. This was no ordinary trial. It was a test of their very souls. For Kale, it meant confronting the shadows that had haunted them since childhood, the fear of failure, the lingering doubt that they were unworthy of this quest. For Lyra, the trial struck deeper, forcing her to question whether she truly believed Kale could succeed. Could they carry the weight of the forgotten scrolls, or was this journey destined to end in ruin? The temple's trial was relentless, weaving illusions that mirrored their deepest fears and insecurities. Kale faced visions of their past mistakes, moments where they had faltered, and the voices of those who had doubted them. But with each step, they found strength in the memory of why they had begun this journey, the hope of restoring balance to a fractured world. Lyra, too, battled her own doubts, realizing that her hesitation wasn't about Kale's abilities, but her own fear of losing another companion to the Veil's darkness. Together, they pushed through, their bond forged stronger by the trial's fire. When they emerged victorious, the celestial being regarded them with solemn approval. Yet its words carried a warning. The power of the forgotten scrolls came with a price. A sacrifice would be demanded, one that neither Kale nor Lyra could yet comprehend. The revelation hung heavy in the air, and Kale's resolve wavered. What would they have to give up? Was the cost too great? But Lyra, her faith now unshaken, placed a hand on Kale's shoulder. "We've come too far to turn back," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever the price, we'll face it together." As they descended from the summit, the storm around them grew fiercer, the Veil's presence pressing closer than ever. The air crackled with tension, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive. Kael and Lyra moved with urgency, the weight of the celestial being's warning still fresh in their minds. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Veil was no longer content to wait. It was coming for them, and the choices they made now would shape the fate of their world. Kael and Lyra raced back to Eldermist, their hearts heavy with the weight of the knowledge they carried. The village, once a sanctuary of peace, now lay shrouded in chaos. Smoke curled into the sky, and the distant cries of villagers pierced the air. Shadows moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing as they descended upon the homes and fields. These creatures born of the Veil were unlike anything they had faced before, their forms flickering like darkness given life. With no time to hesitate, Kael and Lyra sprang into action. Kale's blade flashed in the moonlight, striking down the shadowy figures with precision, while Lyra's magic illuminated the night, her spells weaving a protective barrier around the villagers. Together, they fought with everything they had, but the sheer number of enemies threatened to overwhelm them. Amid the chaos, they spotted the village elder, standing defiantly at the center of the fray, their staff glowing with a faint, ancient light. But as they rushed to the elder's side, a shadow struck with lethal force. The elder fell, gravely wounded, and Kale dropped to their knees beside them. The elder's voice was weak but steady as they spoke, their words carrying the weight of centuries. "The scroll," they gasped, clutching Kale's arm. "It is tied to your bloodline. Only you can unlock its true power." The revelation hit Kale like a thunderclap, a mix of awe and dread settling in their chest. How could something so ancient, so powerful, be connected to them? But there was no time to process it. The elder's grip tightened, their final words a plea. "Protect it, protect us all." As the elder's hand fell limp, Kale felt a surge of resolve. The weight of their lineage, the responsibility placed upon them, it was overwhelming, but they couldn't falter. Not now. Lyra placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, her voice firm yet gentle. "We'll carry this together," she said. "No matter what comes, I'm with you." Her words were a lifeline, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. But the Veil's forces were relentless, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Kael and Lira knew they couldn't stay. They gathered what supplies they could, the scroll now a beacon of both hope and danger. As they slipped into the forest, the sound of pursuit echoed behind them, heavy footsteps, the rustling of unnatural creatures. The night seemed to close in around them, the darkness alive with threat. Yet as they ran, a single thought burned in Kale's mind. This was only the beginning. The journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but they would face it together, bound by duty, loyalty, and the unshakable will to protect what mattered most. The air grew colder as Kale and Lyra stepped deeper into the crystal caves, their footsteps echoing softly against the shimmering walls. The faint glow of the crystals bathed the cavern in an eerie, ethereal light, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with every flicker. It was here, amidst the quiet hum of the caves, that they stumbled upon a group of figures huddled together, dreamers, like themselves, but with a weariness in their eyes that spoke of years spent in hiding. These exiles had been searching for the scroll too, driven by the same desperate hope to stop the Veil. One of them, a woman named Lyra, stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She explained that the Veil's power was growing faster than anyone had anticipated, its tendrils reaching further into the realms with each passing day. The scroll, she revealed, was not just a relic of the past. It was the only weapon capable of sealing the Veil away for good. But there was a catch. The final piece of the scroll, the one that could unlock its full potential, was hidden deep within the Veil's stronghold, a place shrouded in darkness and despair, from which no one had ever returned. The exiles offered to join Kale and Lyra on their quest, their knowledge of the Veil's movements and their own skills making them valuable allies. Kale hesitated, his mind racing. Trust was a fragile thing, especially in a world where the Veil's influence could turn even the closest allies into enemies. Yet, as he looked at Lyra, her resolve unwavering, he knew they couldn't do this alone. The journey ahead was too dangerous, the stakes too high. With a silent nod, Kale accepted the Exiles' offer, sealing their alliance. As they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble building into a deafening roar. The crystals overhead flickered, their light dimming as if suffocated by an unseen force. The veil was coming, its presence felt even here, in the heart of the caves. Kale tightened his grip on his weapon, his heart pounding as the walls seemed to close in around them. There was no turning back now. The battle had found them, and the fate of the realms rested on what they would do next. The journey to the Vale's stronghold was unlike anything the group had faced before. The landscape around them twisted into a desolate wasteland, where jagged rocks clawed at the sky, and the air hung heavy with an unnatural stillness. Every step forward felt like a battle against the very essence of the land itself, as if the world conspired to keep them from their goal. But it wasn't just the terrain that tested them. Shadow creatures emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given life. Each attack was relentless, forcing the group to fight not only for their survival, but for their unity. Trust and resolve were stretched thin, and the cracks began to show. Kale, in particular, bore the weight of the mission like a chain around his neck. The physical strain of the journey was evident in the way his steps faltered and his breath grew ragged, but it was the emotional burden that truly gnawed at him. Doubts whispered in his mind, louder with every passing mile. What if they weren't strong enough? What if they failed, and the Vale's darkness consumed everything? He tried to hide his struggles, to push through, as he always had, but Lyra noticed. Her presence was a quiet anchor amidst the chaos, and when she approached him with words of comfort, Kale's instinct was to retreat. He brushed her off, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the words sounded hollow even to him. The truth was, he feared letting her in. If he admitted how close he was to breaking, it might shatter the fragile hope that held them all together. Lyra's gaze lingered, her concern unspoken but palpable, before she stepped back into the group, leaving Kale to his thoughts. When the stronghold finally loomed into view, it was a sight that chilled the soul. A fortress of darkness rose from the barren land, its spires piercing the sky like claws. The air around it seemed to pulse with malice, and the very ground beneath their feet felt alive with a malevolent energy. It was here, at the edge of the abyss, that the Exiles revealed their final secret, a hidden entrance, concealed by ancient magic. But unlocking it came at a cost. A ritual was required, one that demanded a sacrifice of energy and willpower, and carried with it the risk of death. The group fell silent, the gravity of the moment settling over them like a storm cloud. It was Kale who stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "I'll do it," he said, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. He didn't say it aloud, but they all knew why he volunteered. If anyone could bear the cost, it was him. And if he failed well, the thought was too heavy to dwell on. As the ritual began, the air crackled with tension. The Exiles chanted in a language long forgotten, their voices weaving a tapestry of power that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. Kale stood at the center, his body a conduit for the magic, and as the energy surged through him, he felt the weight of the mission more than ever. It wasn't just about stopping the Veil anymore. It was about proving that even in the face of despair, hope could endure. And as the ground beneath them began to shift, the hidden entrance slowly revealed itself, a testament to their determination and the sacrifices they were willing to make. As Kael and Lyra stepped deeper into the stronghold, the air grew heavy, thick with an eerie silence that seemed to hum with unseen energy. The walls around them shifted, twisting into a labyrinth of narrow corridors and dead ends. Every step forward felt like a gamble, as the floor beneath them gave way to hidden traps, swinging blades, snapping jaws of stone, and walls that threatened to crush them. Kael's instincts sharpened, his eyes scanning for patterns, but the labyrinth was alive, designed to deceive. It wasn't just a physical maze, it was a gauntlet of the mind. Visions began to surface, creeping into their thoughts like whispers. Kale froze as a scene unfolded before him, Lyra lifeless, her light extinguished by the very darkness they were fighting to stop. The image was so vivid, so real, that his chest tightened, and for a moment, doubt clawed at his resolve. But then he heard her voice, faint but steady, calling him back. He clenched his fists, grounding himself in the memory of their bond, the unspoken promise they'd made to each other. Together, they were stronger than any illusion. Lyra, too, faced her own trial. The labyrinth had shown her a world without Kale, a future where she stood alone against the veil's darkness, but she refused to let fear dictate her path. Drawing on the strength of their connection, she pushed through the illusions, her focus unwavering, and then she stumbled upon something unexpected, a hidden chamber, its walls etched with ancient symbols that pulse faintly with light. At its center lay the final piece of the scroll, its power radiating like a beacon, but it was not unguarded. A shadow loomed in the corner of the chamber, shifting and writhing as if it were alive. It was no mere creature, but a manifestation of the veil's malice, a being of pure darkness. Lyra's heart raced as she realized she couldn't face it alone. Without hesitation, she reached out to Kale through their bond, her plea echoing in his mind like a desperate cry. Kale felt it instantly, the pull of her distress cutting through the labyrinth's haze. He moved with urgency, his determination overriding the fatigue that had begun to set in. When he finally reached the chamber, he saw Lyra standing her ground, her hands glowing faintly as she held the shadow at bay. Without a word, they fought as one, their movements synchronized, their strength multiplied. The shadow lashed out, its form twisting and reforming, but Kael and Lyra's bond proved unbreakable. The battle was fierce, but in the end, they emerged victorious. The shadow dissolved into nothingness, its final shriek echoing through the chamber, yet the cost was steep. Lyra collapsed, her energy drained, a deep wound marking her side. Kale caught her, his hands trembling as he tried to steady her. The scroll was within their grasp, but the veil's forces were closing in, their footsteps echoing like distant thunder. Time was running out, and the weight of their journey pressed heavily on Kale's shoulders. They had come so far, but the hardest part was yet to come. The air was thick with tension as Kael and Lyra approached the hidden encampment of the Exiles. The weary group greeted them with a mix of relief and urgency, their faces etched with the weight of survival. But before the reunion could settle into comfort, the forest erupted with movement, shadows twisted and lunged, the veil's minions descending upon them with savage precision. Chaos unfolded in an instant, the exiles scrambling to defend themselves as the creatures closed in with unnerving speed. Amid the frenzy, Kale felt the scroll's energy pulse within them, a strange warmth that seemed to respond to their fear. Without thinking, they raised a hand, and the world seemed to hold its breath. A blinding burst of light erupted from the scroll, a wave of energy that swept through the clearing like a storm. The creatures recoiled, their forms dissolving into ash as the force struck them. For a moment, there was silence, a fragile, trembling calm, but the victory came at a cost. Kale staggered, their strength draining as if the energy had pulled something vital from their very core. The exiles rushed to steady them, their expressions grim. The scroll's power isn't just a tool, one of them explained, their voice heavy with concern. It's tied to your life force. Every time you use it, it takes a piece of you. It's not just exhausting, it's killing you, bit by bit. Kale's chest tightened, their mind racing with the weight of the revelation. The scroll wasn't just a weapon, it was a ticking clock, and each use brought them closer to the end. The thought was terrifying, but even as fear clawed at their heart, Kale's resolve hardened. The veil's darkness was spreading, and there was no time to falter. If this is the price, Kale said, their voice steady despite the exhaustion, then I'll pay it. We can't let them win. The group moved quickly, retreating from the clearing as the forest seemed to close in around them. But as they fled, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe, as if the very land was recoiling from something vast and ancient stirring in the distance. The veil was awakening, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed down on every living thing. Trees withered, their leaves curling and blackening, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with a low, ominous hum. Kale glanced back, their stomach churning with dread. Whatever lay ahead, they knew one thing for certain. The veil's awakening was only the beginning. The journey back to Eldermist was fraught with tension, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on the group. As they reached the village, the air seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that whispered of both hope and dread. Kale stepped forward, the ancient scroll clutched tightly in their hands. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for, the culmination of all their struggles. The ritual to unlock the scroll's full power was not just a test of skill, but of courage and sacrifice. It demanded more than just their strength. It required their very life force. As Kale began the ritual, a cold fear crept into their heart. The thought of death loomed large, a shadow that threatened to consume them. Lyra, ever perceptive, saw the hesitation in their eyes. She stepped closer, her voice soft but urgent. There has to be another way, Kale. We can't lose you, not now, not like this. Her words were a plea, a desperate attempt to sway them from the path they had chosen. But Kale knew the truth. This was their only chance to save Eldermist, to protect the people they loved. The scroll's power was their last hope, and they couldn't turn back. The ritual began, its ancient incantations filling the air with a resonant hum. Kale's hands trembled as they channeled their life force into the scroll, each moment draining them further. But just as the ritual reached its peak, chaos erupted. The Veil's forces descended upon the village, their dark intentions clear. The exiles and villagers rallied to defend their home, the clash of steel and cries of battle echoing through the night. Kale's resolve faltered as they heard the desperate shouts of their people. How could they focus on the ritual when their loved ones were fighting for their lives? Lyra, sensing Kale's struggle, placed a hand on their shoulder. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "You're not alone, Kale. We're here with you. Trust in us and in yourself." Her words were a lifeline, pulling Kale back from the edge of despair. With renewed determination, they poured everything they had into the scroll. The air crackled with energy as the ritual reached its climax, the scroll's power surging like a tidal wave. But as the light faded, Kale collapsed, their body limp and lifeless. The battle raged on around them, but for Kale, the world had gone silent. Their life hung by the thinnest of threads, the cost of their sacrifice all too clear. The air around Eldermist shimmered faintly, a translucent barrier of golden light, stretching across the horizon like a fragile veil of hope. The scroll's ancient magic had done its work, shielding the village from the encroaching darkness of the veil. But even as the barrier held, a quiet unease settled over the land. Kale, the one who had called upon the scroll's power, lay motionless, their strength drained by the immense effort. The barrier, though powerful, began to flicker and wane as the veil's forces pressed harder against it, its energy slowly unraveling with each passing moment. Lyra, her heart heavy with worry, knelt beside Kale, their breathing shallow and uneven. The exiles gathered around, their faces etched with concern. Among the group, whispers of desperation began to surface. The scroll's power might be the only thing that can save them, one of them murmured, their voice trembling with uncertainty. Lyra's mind raced as she weighed the impossible choice before her. To use the scroll's energy to heal Kale would mean weakening the very barrier that protected them all. Yet, leaving Kale to fade would be unthinkable. With a deep breath, Lyra made her decision. Her hands trembled as she unfurled the scroll, its glowing symbols casting an otherworldly light across the room. She channeled its energy into Kale, feeling the warmth of its magic flow through her like a river of light. The barrier outside flickered once more, its golden hue dimming as the scroll's strength was diverted. Slowly, color returned to Kale's cheeks, their breathing steadied, and their eyes fluttered open. Relief washed over Lyra, but it was short-lived. Kale's first words were filled with anguish. "What have you done?" they whispered, their voice cracking under the weight of guilt. They knew the cost of their revival, the risk it posed to Eldermist. Lyra placed a hand on their shoulder, her gaze steady. "We'll find another way," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her heart. "The scroll's power is only part of the answer. We'll find a way to strengthen the barrier and stop the veil together." As the group rallied around them, a renewed sense of purpose took hold. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer powerless. The scroll had given them a chance, and now it was up to them to seize it. The veil might be growing stronger, but so too was their resolve. The fight for Eldermist was far from over, and in the face of darkness, even the smallest spark of hope could light the way forward. The air was heavy with tension as Kale and Lyra stood at the edge of the village, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the veil's stronghold loomed like a shadow against the sky. Around them, the villagers and exiles gathered, their faces etched with determination and fear. This was no ordinary battle. It was a fight for the very soul of their world, a desperate gamble to reclaim the light stolen by the veil. Kale's heart pounded as they surveyed the group, a mix of dreamers, warriors, and ordinary people who had chosen to stand together against an unimaginable darkness. Lyra's hand brushed against Kale's, a silent reminder of the bond they shared. It was this connection, this unshakable trust, that gave Kale the courage to take the first step forward. Yet, beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at them. What if they failed? What if their plan was not enough to pierce the veil's suffocating grip? The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Kale's shoulders, but they couldn't let it show. Not now, not when so many were counting on them. As they moved through the land, the environment itself seemed to resist them. The once vibrant fields had turned barren, the trees twisted and lifeless. The sky, once a canvas of stars, was now a void of oppressive darkness. Each step brought them closer to the veil's stronghold, and with it, a growing sense of dread. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the very essence of despair was closing in around them. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Kale noticed something remarkable. The people behind them, their footsteps steady, their resolve unbroken. They were not just following Kael and Lira. They were fighting for themselves, for their homes, for the future they refused to let the veil take away. Kale's thoughts turned to the dreamers among them, those who still held the power to shape reality with their minds. They were the key to this plan, the only ones who could challenge the veil's corrupting influence. But even they seemed weakened by the oppressive atmosphere, their light flickering like candles in a storm. Kale knew they had to act quickly. Time was running out, and the veil's power was growing stronger with every passing moment. As they approached the stronghold, a massive obsidian fortress, rising from the earth like a jagged scar, Kale felt a surge of determination. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for, the moment that would define their world's fate. They glanced at Lyra, who met their gaze with a reassuring nod. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead. The final confrontation was upon them, and Kale knew there was no turning back. They would give everything, every ounce of strength, every spark of hope, to protect what they held dear. The battle for their world was about to begin, and failure was not an option. The battlefield erupted in chaos as Kael and Lira surged forward, their voices ringing out above the clash of steel and the roar of magic. The dreamers, united in purpose, fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of hope. Yet, for every step they gained, the veil's forces seemed to grow stronger, their shadowy forms twisting and writhing like a living nightmare. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the weight of despair, as if the veil's presence was suffocating the very light from the world. Kale gripped the forgotten scroll tightly, its ancient symbols pulsing with a faint, golden light. Each time they channeled its power, a wave of energy surged through them, weakening the veil's hold and driving back its minions. But with every use, the toll became more apparent. Their body trembled, their breath grew shallow, and a cold numbness crept into their limbs. The scroll was a double-edged sword, its power both their greatest weapon and their undoing. Lyra fought fiercely at their side, her blade a blur of motion as she cut down anything that dared to approach. Her eyes never left Kale, her determination unwavering as she shielded them from harm. She knew the stakes. Every second Kale spent focusing on the scroll brought them closer to the edge, but it was the only way to turn the tide. As the battle raged on, the sky above seemed to darken, the clouds swirling into a vortex of shadow. And then, with a deafening roar, the veil itself emerged. It was a towering figure, its form shifting and writhing, a mass of darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. Its eyes burned with a cold, malevolent fire, and its voice echoed like 1,000 whispers, each one filled with despair. The dreamers faltered, their courage wavering in the face of such overwhelming power. Kale felt the weight of the moment settle upon their shoulders. This was it, their final chance to stop the veil, to save the realms from its endless hunger. The scroll's light flickered in their hands, a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. They knew what had to be done, even if it meant sacrificing everything. With a deep breath, they stepped forward, Lyra close behind, her presence a silent promise that they wouldn't face this alone. The battle had reached its peak, and the fate of all would be decided in the next moments. Kale stood at the edge of the abyss, the veil's dark tendrils writhing like a storm made of shadow. The ancient scroll pulsed in their hands, its light flickering with a rhythm that matched their heartbeat. With a deep breath, they began to channel its power, weaving threads of energy into a rift that shimmered like a tear in the fabric of reality. The air crackled, and for a moment, it seemed as though the veil might falter, its malevolent presence recoiling from the brilliant light. But then, it surged forward, its resistance fierce and unrelenting. Kale gritted their teeth, feeling the strain as the veil fought back, its power threatening to overwhelm them. The scroll demanded more and more energy, more life force. Kale's breath grew shallow, their vision blurring as they poured every ounce of strength into the rift. Their knees buckled, and they could feel the cold grip of death creeping closer. Just as they teetered on the edge, a warm hand clasped theirs, Lyra. Her voice, steady and resolute, broke through the chaos. "You're not doing this alone," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. Without hesitation, she offered her own life force, her energy merging with Kale's in a surge of light so pure, it seemed to push back the very darkness itself. Together, their combined power forced the veil toward the rift. The entity howled, its form twisting and distorting as it was dragged into the void. The ground trembled, and the skies above cleared as the veil's influence weakened. But the victory came at a cost. As the last wisp of darkness vanished into the rift, Kael and Lira collapsed, their bodies drained and their faces pale. The land around them began to heal, the once barren earth sprouting green shoots, and the air filling with the sounds of life returning. Yet the two heroes lay motionless, their fates hanging in the balance. The world had been saved, but at what price? Kael and Lyra stirred awake to the soft rustling of leaves and the faint glow of dawn breaking over Eldermist. Around them, their people moved with a quiet energy, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. The veil, once a suffocating shroud over the land, had vanished, and the air felt lighter, clearer. Yet, as Kale stood and looked upon the faces of those who had fought alongside them, a weight settled in his chest. The cost of their victory was etched in every expression, every silence that lingered where laughter might have been. He could still hear the echoes of battle, the cries of those who had fallen heroes, who would never see the world they had saved. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "We lost much," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "But look at what we've gained. The land breathes again, and our people are free." That hope, Kale, it's worth everything. Her words were a balm, but they couldn't erase the ache entirely. Kale nodded, his gaze drifting to the villagers and exiles who had gathered in the clearing. They sang and laughed, their voices weaving together in a melody of resilience and triumph. Yet, even in this moment of celebration, Kale felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. The forgotten scroll, now restored, pulsed faintly in his satchel, a reminder of its immense power and the dangers it could still bring. He glanced at Lyra, who met his eyes with a knowing look. Together, they had faced darkness and emerged victorious, but the scroll's existence was a double-edged sword. Its magic could heal or destroy, and there would always be those who sought to wield it for their own ends. "We can't let it fall into the wrong hands," Kale murmured, his voice low but firm. "Not after all we've sacrificed." Lyra squeezed his hand, her resolve mirroring his own. "Then we'll guard it together, not just for us, but for everyone who believed in this fight." The promise hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Their journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the recovering land, Kael and Lira turned their eyes to the horizon. Beyond the trees, beyond the mountains, lay uncharted paths and untold stories waiting to unfold. The road ahead would be uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kale felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost. Hope, not just for the future of Eldermist, but for the adventures yet to come. Kael and Lira stood side by side, the crisp morning air brushing against their faces as they gazed over the sprawling expanse of Eldermist. The once shadowed land now shimmered faintly under the golden light of dawn, its forests and rivers slowly reclaiming their vitality. The forgotten scroll, now secure in its hidden sanctuary, seemed to hum faintly in the distance, a reminder of the trials they had endured. Kale's hands rested on the hilt of his sword, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings, a symbol of the journey that had transformed him. He was no longer the wide-eyed dreamer who had stumbled into this quest. The weight of his choices, the battles fought, and the sacrifices made had forged him into something more. A hero, yes, but also someone who understood the cost of protecting what mattered most. Lyra's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "We did it," she said, her silver hair catching the light like threads of moonlight. "Even when it felt impossible, we kept going." Kale turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She had been his anchor, her quiet strength, a constant through the chaos. Their bond, once tentative and uncertain, had deepened into something unshakable. He nodded, his voice low. "We did, but it wasn't just us. Everyone who believed in us, everyone who fought alongside us, they made this possible." The scars of the Veil's influence were still visible across the land, twisted trees, patches of barren earth, and the lingering unease in the hearts of the people. Yet there was hope. The world was healing, slowly but surely, and Kale felt a quiet pride in knowing they had played a part in that. The rising sun painted the horizon in hues of amber and rose, and for a moment, everything felt still. Kale exhaled, a sense of peace settling over him. This was what they had fought for, this quiet, this beauty, this chance for renewal. But even as the warmth of the sunrise enveloped them, The faintest whisper echoed in the back of Kale's mind. The scroll, though hidden, was not silent. Its ancient power seemed to murmur of mysteries untouched, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Kale's hand tightened on his sword, not out of fear, but anticipation. The scroll had chosen him, and its whispers felt like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. There was more to this story, more to their world, and Kale couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond the horizon. Lyra glanced at him, her sharp eyes catching the shift in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Kale hesitated, then shook his head with a faint laugh. "Nothing, just wondering what's next." Lyra's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Whatever it is," she said, her voice firm, "we'll face it together." As the first rays of sunlight bathed the land, Kale felt a surge of gratitude for the journey, for the people who had stood by him, and for the quiet moments like this one. The forgotten scroll had brought them here, but it was their choices, their courage, and their bond that had shaped their path. And as they stood there, watching the world awaken, Kale knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.